long as to see another Democratic presidential inauguration. I am so thrilled Mr. Kennedy has invited me. Well, after all, who am I? Just the very old widow of a long-dead president. Nobody remembers presidents' wives. I know that. Even during the presidency, we're little more than a White House decoration or a token of some man's good taste. But I ask you, how many presidents fell in love and got married while they were in office? Well, that's what makes me different. Well, and that's not the only thing that makes me different. Now, I remember I once asked Woodrow if he thought that there would ever be a woman president elected, and he said, "Ha! That's about as likely as a Negro president. Not in 100 years." Well, I don't know if there ever is going to be a woman elected president, but, well, when Woodrow suffered a stroke, someone had to take charge, even for a few months, and, well, that someone was me. Now, I see you're skeptical. I understand. I look in the mirror, and when I see this wrinkled old hobgoblin staring back at me, I find it hard to believe that she held history once in her hand. But, well, that was a long time ago. After Woodrow's death, I published my memoir. Well, I had to. There were lies told about me. It was rumored that I had caused Woodrow's stroke, or even worse, that I had poisoned his first wife. It's ridiculous nonsense. I had to defend my reputation. So I set down the story of our lives together, but there are some things I had to leave out. Now, can I trust you with those secrets? Well, now, you see, in my memoir, it was important for me to play down my role about how much I did when Woodrow was stricken. Now, what am I going to wear? I was thinking of wearing this, but, well, it's snowing outside. I'm afraid I might freeze to death. Do you think Mrs. Kennedy is worrying about what she's going to be wearing? I don't think so. She's so young and pretty. Did she ever imagine she'd be married to the President of the United States? Well, I certainly didn't. I mean, after all, when he was first elected, Woodrow was happily married to Ellen, his wife of many years. No one thought that she would die when he was in the office. How did I meet the president? Well, it was a series of unlikely coincidences. Now, my first husband, Norman Gold, died a few years ago. Now, well, I liked Norman. I really hadn't been interested in marrying him, but my circumstances gave me a few options. My family approved, though, because he owned Galt's Jewelry, and they had catered to the Washington elite for over a decade. Well, when he died, everybody expected me to sell the jewelry business, and we were happy enough. But I wouldn't say I loved him. But I liked running the jewelry business, and it flourished when I owned it. And, well, then there was another death that changed the course of my life. Now, my good friend, James Golden, on his deathbed, asked me to take care of his daughter, Altrude. And here I was in my late 30s, having to take care of a headstrong 17-year-old who I really didn't know at all. And well, I thought, what better way for us to get to know each other than to travel? So we sailed for Europe on the Lusitania. Yes, that ship. I'll get to that part later, but well, I had not anticipated the effect that Altrude would have on all the men on board of the ship. She had so many suitors clamoring to dance with her. Chip sides the boat over, but what a surprise that, well, I had one too. A British Army officer, no less. Well, I hadn't danced in 20 years. Da, 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 da. Well, is there anything more romantic than dance? But for 2 months, Altrude and I traveled through Europe, ending up in Paris, where we spent almost all of our time in the Paris fashion houses, and we each came home with a new wardrobe. I wish I could turn the clock back, but I digress. But I'll mention Altrude because, well, it was through her that I first met Woodrow and went to the White House. Now, although I had lived in Washington for 15 years, I never paid attention to politics, since back then women weren't allowed to vote. In fact, in the election of 1912, I didn't even know who the candidates were. We heard the news in Paris that Mr. Woodrow Wilson had won. Well, the name didn't mean anything to me. So, but upon my return, my mission was to find a suitable husband for Altrude. So needless to say, he had to come from a good family and be a gentleman and have a good position. And so immediately, this eliminated almost all of her admirers. But then there was a Mr. Dr. Grayson. And I asked him about his practice. It's very small, Mrs. Galt. I have just one patient. Oh, just the one, I inquired. Perhaps he was not a good prospect after all. Yes, ma'am, the president. Ooh, the president's personal physician. Oh, my. Now, here was a good catch for Altrude. Now, as access to her was through me, I got to know Dr. Grayson very well, and I enjoyed his stories about the White House. And I was sorry to hear about Mrs. Wilson's illnesses and that she died so suddenly. And how could poor Mr. Wilson cope with this tragedy just as war was breaking out on Europe? And then Dr. Grayson introduced me to Helen, who was filling in for the role of hostess since the First Lady had passed. Now, I told you I had no interest in the Washington social circles, but Helen and I would often go walking together, and one day she suggested that we stop by the White House for some tea. Well, I protested, but she assured me that the president was out. So imagine my surprise when I stepped off the elevator and we ran smack into him. I was so embarrassed. I was not dressed properly and I had mud all over my clothes. Mrs. Galt, no apologies necessary. I'm sure a muddy dress has never looked so pretty in the White House. Grayson has told me so much about you. I'm delighted you are here, with or without a little mud. Well, after that, of course, I stayed for some tea. And oh, how we talked. So many stories about our families in Virginia. Well, we laughed at how we both been frightened of our fathers. Mine was a Presbyterian. Well, his was a Presbyterian minister. Mine was a judge. And, well, Woodrow was amused to learn that I had been descended from Pocahontas. And he used to tease me about me being his Indian princess. And he found out that we both loved traveling in France. And he gave me this book by a Scottish painter, Hamilton's Round My House. That's his first gift to me. I still have a copy, obviously. Well, speaking of gifts, it was about this time that Altrude realized that she began receiving flowers from Dr. Grayson every day. So I realized it was time to have the talk. You see, I've noticed that women see flowers as innocent tokens of friendship. But for men, flowers are the keys to the kingdom, if you know what I mean. Now, of course, Altrude was shocked when I suggested that Dr. Grayson's intentions might be anything less than honorable. She swore he was not like other men. And I lectured her that if she wanted to win her man, it was essential that she withhold her affections from him. But Edie, don't the flowers show I've already earned his heart? Well, when his ring is on your finger, then we'll know that you have caught him. So a few days later, Altrude and I went to the dinner at the White House, and the president greeted me warmly with flowers. For me? Oh, Mr. President, I don't know what to say. Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, this was something I had not expected. Now, it had been a long time since I had caught the eye of an attractive man. And make no mistake about it, the President of the United States was a very attractive man. And I became a frequent dinner guest. And now one day stands out in my memory. On May 4th, after dinner, the White House, the other guests had left, and well, for a lawyer and a politician so skilled with words, Woodrow was fumbling over what he was trying to say. And well, after a long preamble, he professed that he was in love with me. Well, of course, I could see that coming. But I didn't expect him to take my hand and then kiss me with such ardor that I almost fell out of my chair. I didn't expect that from a president, and certainly not from a devout Presbyterian. And then he asked me to marry him. Well, this was all too fast. We'd only known each other for a few weeks. If he wanted an answer immediately, it would have to be no. And I could see he was disappointed. As for me, to discover that someone, well, not just someone, the President of the United States had fallen in love with me, well, I just wanted to dance around the house. Well, 3 days later, I was back at the White House, and when Woodrow received a telegram from Winston Churchill, "Oh, dear God, they've sunk the Lusitania. That must be a mistake. The Lusitania isn't a battleship, it's a liner." Well, I recall my own time on the boat. All I could think of were those poor women and children drowning as the ship went down. And I mumbled something about feeling so insignificant compared with the huge crises he had to deal with. "No, Edith, this crisis shows me how much I need you. I need you to be beside me as my wife." I wanted to say yes so badly, but this would cause such a scandal So soon after Ellen's death, I just asked him to be patient. Well, the Lusitania crisis continued for several weeks, and Berlin accused the ship of being armed and carrying military supplies for the Allies. Woodrow worked on a reply, and when he showed it to me, well, I realized it was weak. In an earlier letter to Berlin, now I had felt his anger, but this one might as well have been drafted by a secretary. Drafted by a secretary. It's that bad. I asked my cabinet to read it, but none of them told me it was weak. Now you see, you can give me advice, and I want you to. I want to hear it. You know, people thought Woodrow was cold and aloof. And I can assure you that he was anything but. Oh, no. He was not. But he could be moody. One day there was a black cloud over his head, and I asked him whether it was the war in Europe. The war in Europe? No, it's you, Edith. Can't you see you're tormenting me? I spend my days wondering if you'll ever give me an answer. He told me he was canceling cabinet meetings because he couldn't stop thinking about me. Well, I felt terrible. I was distracting him from his work, and, well, so I told him that I loved him and that I would marry him, but I insisted that our engagement couldn't be announced until a year after Ellen's death. So spending time together wasn't easy, but he had a suggestion. Now look at this desk. There's space for two of us. You can sit here and help me. So I began to sit at his desk. At first, my help, well, couldn't really call it help. He'd sign a document and give it to me to blot. But we were like two lovebirds. You know, how the male bird offers the female bird some delicacy, some fat, juicy worm or a nut. Now, Woodrow would offer me tidbits of information about people in government and when it was working on and about their private lives, and I loved that. Now, I must admit, my eyes glazed over when we talk about the economy. You wouldn't think working on documents was romantic, but at times he'd put the papers down and he'd kiss my hand. And more than once, I had to tell him to control himself and put away his naughty thoughts. But I shouldn't be telling you all this. Well, there were so many issues at home and abroad that confronted him. I remember when he heard of the news of a lynching in South Carolina. Edith, how can we speak out against tyranny overseas and then tolerate such behavior here? Well, I urged him to condemn lynching publicly, which he did. Now, I'd always thought Woodrow had been supportive of Negro rights, but apparently some of them didn't think he was supportive enough. There were problems in the post office. Now, the post office general had pushed for the segregation of the races, and Woodrow saw this as reasonable. He argued that when you have two groups of people who are at odds with each other, then you can either try to force them to live together peacefully, or you can separate them. Forcing them together wasn't working. So separation seemed to be the right answer. Well, it made sense, and I agreed, but some of their leaders complained about the situation. One of them even came into the White House and argued with the president. Woodrow was livid. He came in here and telling me I betrayed him and his followers. What did he think he was, barging in here and trying to push me around? Well, I could tell Woodrow was upset. And I told him he shouldn't let his anger get the better of his judgment. Judgment be damned. That man was rude and offensive, and I've had all manner of people in here, and I'm not going to let some uppity Negro push me around. Well, Woodrow is getting very hot under the collar, so I decided to change the subject to our upcoming nuptials. But weddings can cause a lot of tension. Now, I wanted the wedding to be small and private and limited to just the family. But Woodrow wanted to invite Colonel House, and then Colonel House would invite the Congress, and then the Democrats, and then the Republicans. And then I just had to put my foot down. It would just be family, and that was that. Now, as you know, Woodrow was Presbyterian, and I was Episcopalian, so we decided to have two ministers conduct our service. Now, I picked a bishop whose father had officiated at my parents' wedding, and shortly before the wedding, he asked if his wife could attend. It would mean so much to her she could be at the president's wedding. Well, this was nonsense. The bishop knew it was to be the family only, and his wife just wanted to brag that she'd been at the wedding and at the president. I told him it was impossible to add her to the guest list. And then to save the bishop the embarrassment, I excused him from performing the ceremony. Oh, yes, we had a honeymoon in Hot Springs, Virginia. For a few days, there were no papers for Woodrow to sign, and no cabinet secretaries worrying about this or that. Oh, it was bliss. But the European conflict refused to honor the Do Not Disturb sign on our honeymoon door. Mr. Tumulty Woodrow's secretary called to say that another ship had been sunk by the Germans, and would Woodrow please come back to deal with the situation. Now, why Joe Tumulty couldn't have waited a few days, I don't know. It did irritate me, his interrupting the president's honeymoon for something that really wasn't a crisis. Well, returning to Washington, I met the crowds that came out to greet us. And I knew I was being inspected. And judging by their reaction, I wasn't a liability. During the election, I am sure that I had won Woodrow some votes, particularly in the West, where women could vote. Oh, yes, back then, women didn't have the vote. Oh, you probably think I was a suffragist, didn't you? No, I hated those women. We all did. Woodrow, my sisters, my friends. There was all this talk about women's rights and even the notion that we were equal. Well, when I grew up, and for most of my life, this was a ridiculous idea. It was self-evident that we were not equal, and most of us were happy with this situation. I don't think we're equal. We're not as strong as men, and neither are we as brutish. We're certainly less aggressive, and we're not as arrogant. Well, we notice things men are blind to. But can we govern? Well, I'll let you be the judge. Woodrow's success in keeping America out of the war in Europe was a major theme of his re-election campaign. By staying neutral, he saw a chance to act as a peacemaker, but Germany misled him. Publicly, they were for peace negotiation, but they announced a major submarine offensive against all vessels in the Atlantic. And then we learned they were encouraging Mexico to attack, and if you can believe it, take back Texas. Woodrow struggled with the decision to go to war. He feared that war would change the country and make us ruthless and intolerant, but it seemed to me that Germany had crossed a line, and I told him he really had no choice. And so Woodrow asked Congress for the declaration of war. Well, given Woodrow's forebodings, I was fearful of what would happen. In a strange way, though, it brought the country together. People put aside their differences. Well, I wanted to do my part. So I volunteered with a Red Cross unit who fed soldiers passing through Washington. We gave them coffee and handed out sandwiches and cigarettes. And they were just boys, children. Many of them never returned. All across the country, men were signing up with the Army. And I suggested to Woodrow that maybe we could free up some of the gardeners and for service if we got some, instead of mowing the lawns, if we got some sheep. Sheep? Edith, that's a ridiculous idea. We'll be the laughing stock of the press. Well, a week later, the sheep arrived, 8 of them. And the press did make fun of us, but the public loved the sheep, especially after there were 12 lambs born. And that first year, our sheep gave us 98 pounds of wool. And my idea was to have the wool auctioned. And this raised $100,000 for the Red Cross. And I love those sheep. There was a midterm election just before the war ended. Woodrow knew it would help his peace negotiations if the Senate and the Congress were supportive. So he wrote a letter to the nation asking them to give him a Democratic House and Senate. Now, I knew it was a mistake, and I told him not to send it, but he wouldn't listen. Oh, I could see it was going to enrage the Republicans. Oh my, did it anger them. We lost both houses. Woodrow now had to work with enemies. One of them was Henry Cabot Lodge. He hated Woodrow, and now he'd become leader of the Senate. You know, I believe it was jealousy that motivated Lodge. Before Woodrow, Lodge was the scholar in Washington. Lodge was a snob. If there was ever an aristocracy in America, his family was part of it. He looked down on Woodrow because Woodrow was a Southerner. Lodge opposed Woodrow on everything, even his decision to go to the peace treaty at Versailles. Well, Woodrow wouldn't go to Paris without me. And I must confess, my mind was a whirl about going to Paris with the president. Oh, and then Lodge accused us of taking a tourist trip. So we arrived in Paris in mid-November, but the conference was delayed. So we accepted the King of England's invitation to visit London. The prospect of meeting King George and his wife, Queen Mary, made me nervous. How do I greet them? Do I curtsy? No, Edith, curtsying is for servants. We're their equals. We'll be respectful and shake their hands as we would with leaders back home. Well, the king and queen were just fine with our manners, and we had an extraordinary state dinner at Buckingham Palace. And at the appropriate hour, 2 elderly gentlemen arrived at our rooms to escort us to the royal family. And they stood facing us, and then together they each took a bow and then stepped back and bowed. Well, of course, I expect them to turn around and then we'd follow them to wherever they were meant to go. But no, they kept walking backwards the whole way, each time followed by bow. And they reversed, bowing up every step. I keep thinking that those elderly gentlemen were going to fall and break their necks. But they successfully escorted us to their hosts. Now, I wore this velvet evening gown with a train, and the Queen wore this dazzling white gown with the Order of the Garter across her bodice. Now, I know something about jewels, but I have never seen such diamonds. Now, to the music of Elgin, the King of England himself escorted me into the dining room. Da, 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 da. Well, could anything be more impressive than this bejeweled procession? Well, possibly the dining room itself. Everything there was gold, gold plates, gold cutlery, gold candelabras, gold dishes, and enough gold on the wall to put Fort Knox to shame. For a moment, I confess, I became a monarchist. I'll tell you, this feeling was dashed when they began to play I guess they were trying to make us feel at home. Well, we returned to Paris and to the Versailles. I'm going to just take this off a moment, if you'll excuse me. That is so much better. We returned to Paris, and eventually the treaty negotiations began at Versailles. Oh, the bureaucracy, the committees, the meeting, it was too much. Woodrow had two overriding issues he wanted to fight for: the right of the people to self-determination and the League of Nations. Having all nations subscribe to one international organization would maintain peace. It seemed to be our only hope to keep peace and prevent future wars. Well, much of the world agreed. It never occurred to us that the Senate might not ratify the League. What cemented his determination was when we visited a cemetery in France. It was a bleak day, and what had been a rolling hill was now row upon row of white crosses, as far as the eye could see. Now, Woodrow knelt down beside one of those crosses and read the inscription, and he ran his hand over it and he wept. I was their commander-in-chief. I sent these boys here. They died fighting for freedom. I can't let their deaths have been in vain. Well, that's why he wouldn't compromise on the League of Nations. It was something that he could honor. He had to honor their sacrifice. And walking through the cemetery, I tried to think of each cross representing a life. It didn't seem real. But the effects of war were very real. And whenever I visited hospitals for the wounded, and I visited many, my routine was to shake the soldiers' hands and thank them. It was awkward and inadequate, but they were appreciative. Now, one ward was mainly head wounds. Now, how do you not recoil when you see a disfigured face? Here was a room of disfigured faces. There was this one man who had a hole where his nose and eyes had been. A few months later, he'd been a handsome boy, maybe with a girlfriend. Wouldn't it have been better for him to have been killed on the battlefield? What could his future be? I told Woodrow that all politicians contemplating war should be forced to visit a hospital like the one outside Paris. And he agreed. We returned from France, hopeful about the future. We thought we were leaving behind the conniving, duplicitous politicians of Europe for honest statesmen in America. Oh, how wrong we were. Woodrow invited Lodge and the Foreign Relations Committee to dinner to discuss the League of Nations. He laid out for them its principles and how he saw it contributing to peace. Wasn't peace what everybody wanted? We took Lodge's comments as indicating that his support for the League. The very next day, he came out against it. Lodge was a lawyer. He used his lawyerly skills to turn every virtue of the League into a vice. The battle became personal. If Lodge disliked Woodrow, he was downright contemptuous of me. I overheard him talking to his friends one day. The first Mrs. Wilson, now she was a fine lady who knew her station, but this woman, I sat next to her once at a state dinner. She didn't understand what we were discussing. You hear, Mrs. Wilson, and you know why women should never be allowed to vote. Like my pet parrot, she kept preening her feathers. I hated that man. Woodrow became obsessed in his fight with Lodge over the League. He couldn't sleep, and I worried about his constant headaches. But Woodrow was determined to bring the Lodge to fruition and wanted to waste no time. And so we embarked on a whistle-stop tour across the country, bringing the idea of the League of Nations to the people. Sometimes Woodrow gave 3 speeches a day. There was no let-up. His headaches became excruciating, and Grayson warned him about his high blood pressure. Near the end of the trip, he was collapsing. Well, against his will, Grayson and I canceled the last few stops and rushed him back to Washington. Well, we'd been back just a couple of days when early one morning I heard a crash. Woodrow! Woodrow, are you all right? Grayson! I called for help. Is he going to be all right? Grayson didn't know. As it turned out, he had had a stroke. He was unconscious and his left side was paralyzed. But Grayson was going to release a statement saying that Woodrow had had a stroke, and I was absolutely livid about this, against it. No, I was not going to allow that to happen. He would be forced to be removed from office, and this would kill him. Certainly the country wasn't going to grind to the halt if the president was absent for a few days. I didn't realize it would be months. I convinced Grayson to announce that the president was suffering from nervous exhaustion. And for the moment, somebody else would have to take charge. Well, how difficult could that be? My determination to keep things running while Woodrow recovered was shared by his personal secretary, Joseph Tumulty. I'm embarrassed to say that I had once pressed Woodrow to fire Tumulty. I thought he was a liability. You see, Tumulty was Irish Catholic. I thought it would cost Woodrow votes. But, well, I see you smiling. Yes, I know. We're celebrating the inauguration of Mr. Kennedy, the first Catholic Irish president. So times do change. Well, after me, no one loved Woodrow as much as Joe. And he had his talents. Some of them worried me. He could forge Woodrow's signature. I'd seen potential for mischief there. More than that, he could write a letter I'd sworn had been written by Woodrow. In the current crisis, now this was a gift. Let me explain. Excuse me. I've been talking too much. I'm parched. Now, growing up in the judge's house, I never drank. But at my first dinner in France, oh my goodness, I spilled all over the place. I'll have to get this later. At my first dinner in France, our host thrust a glass into my hand and proposed a toast. Santé. Well, it happened so quickly. I found myself with a mouth full of cool liquid bursting with tiny bubbles. And after the initial shock, I discovered that champagne was all right. And it was followed by a glass of red wine. And now that was a little less to my liking. But then with dessert, that was pure joy. This I learned was Sauterne, and I have savored many a glass since. But I'm getting distracted again. Well, the very first crisis I faced was how to handle the Volstead bill, or better known as Prohibition. And it would have banned the sweet elixir. Congress submitted the bill for the president to sign. Now, you probably think a Presbyterian president wouldn't drink, but that's not true. Whenever he visited the troops, he made a point of enjoying a beer with them. And he also indulged in an occasional scotch or bourbon with a friend. Now, Woodrow and I, we could both see the problems caused by drink, but was prohibition the answer? Woodrow argued that the rich would still get their drinks regardless, but the working man who loved his glass of beer after a hard day, he would be deprived. Woodrow would go along with banning spirits, but not beer or wine. So what was I to do? Well, I turned to Joe Tumulty, who was against prohibition. After all, he was Irish. I asked him to draft a letter as if it was from Woodrow, indicating why he was vetoing the Volstead bill. I hope you'll agree this was a small but worthy deception. And Congress's response to my first executive action, they overrode my veto. Well, we all know the consequences, a decade of crime and violence, because there were those who couldn't go without. For most of the population, those were very unhappy years. We'd all expected the war's end would bring joy and prosperity, and it was the opposite. The country seemed to be falling apart. The troops returned, and unemployment shot up, and there were strikes everywhere. To sort this mess out, Woodrow had convened a conference bringing together representatives of all sides. Now, the Secretary of the Interior, ignorant of the president's condition, sent a draft of a letter he hoped Woodrow would send to the conference. It was very thoughtful of him because we used every word of it. And I smiled when the New York Times declared that the president, in spite of his poor health, was so closely following the conference. Then there were international crises too. Well, when I didn't know how to deal with them, I sent the Secretary of State a message. The president says it is impossible for him to take up such matters until he is stronger and can study them. Of course, he didn't say anything. But I had discovered a wonderful way to procrastinate. And let me tell you, procrastination solves a lot of problems. One crisis that I do remember was in Europe, Eastern Europe. I had authorized wheat sales to Poland and the Russian Relief Fund. 40 years on, half the globe lives under Soviet domination. Could I have used wheat to influence the outcome of history? Probably not. The Bolsheviks were quite prepared to let billions die. I acted from compassion. As you know, compassion was not part of their ideology. The Bolsheviks were trying to start a revolution here, too. Agents were coming in disguised as Russian immigrants, and there had been a spate of bomb attacks. Now, the Attorney General had been a target, and a bomb had destroyed half of his house. Now, he was a Quaker, and so he should have been a peace-loving man, but after the bomb, he became decidedly not Quaker. He came to me wanting Woodrow's approval to go after the Bolsheviks. Of course, I didn't want him at Woodrow's bedside, so I said I would relay his message. I knew Woodrow never wanted immigrants to be used as scapegoats for the problems the country was facing, but, well, these weren't immigrants that were to be welcomed. They were spies and agents coming in with malice against us, and our decision was easy. The security of the nation is the first duty of every president, and I knew that. So I told the Attorney General that the president agreed with his plan to round up the Bolsheviks and have them deported. And in charge of the operation was a young and enthusiastic subordinate of Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. Now, those raids were where he got his start. Now, I liked Mr. Hoover, although many people seemed scared of him, but he always complimented my dresses and asked me where I bought them. He was a very sweet man. Well, the raids against the Bolsheviks were a success. Many were caught and deported, and most of the country felt safer. I am convinced it was the right thing to do, although we may have gone too far. A few innocent people were treated badly. Many blamed the president. Well, that made me mad. I wanted to explain he hadn't even known about the plan. But I also wanted to tell them that they ought to be grateful, because didn't they realize we had saved them from a bloody revolution? Now, the State of the Union address was in early December. Now, although he was recovering, Woodrow wasn't up yet to delivering the message to the Congress. But then I had an idea. Until Woodrow, presidents had sent their State of the Union addresses to Congress as a letter. Woodrow had insisted on giving it in person in a speech, but well, why couldn't we just go back to sending it as a letter? So I worked with Mr. Tumulty, and together we composed the State of the Union address. No one was the wiser. How long did I keep the president's health concealed? Well, all of October and most of December and November. Well, during the time During that time, I only allowed doctors and family to see him. He didn't see anyone from the cabinet. Grayson continued to give optimistic updates about the president improving, and in fact, he was. We were having coherent conversations, although the poor man sounded like he had had one scotch too many. His absence from public life did raise questions. Now, Lodge wanted to have the president's health assessed by someone other than Grayson. So he found a cause that supposedly required a meeting with the president. Some American businessman had been kidnapped by Mexican forces. 2 senators were dispatched to the White House to discuss the situation with Mr. Wilson. Grayson worried, but I had a plan. I thought that if Woodrow's left side was covered up and he was propped up in bed with his right arm exposed and the lighting was low, perhaps they wouldn't notice his left side was paralyzed. Well, I was worried when I learned that the Republican senator picked by Lodge to evaluate Woodrow would be Albert Fall, that rattlesnake from Mexico. Has there ever been a more corrupt politician? Later, he went to prison for accepting bribes. I spent the morning briefing Woodrow about the Mexican crisis. He kept muddling up the details and forgetting what this was about, but Grayson and I did have one ace up our sleeve. Upon entering Woodrow's room, Mr. Fall greeted the president with false haughtiness. "Mr. President, how are you? We've been praying for you." "Which way, Senator?" Woodrow still had his wits about him. They discussed the Mexican situation, and with his right hand, Woodrow gave him the papers. All the while, he kept his left side covered up. I realized he remembered almost everything that I had told him, and that he projected an air of authority. And then Grayson played our trump card. He was called out of the room and returned a few minutes later. "Mr. President, I apologize for the interruption. I just wanted to let you know that the crisis in Mexico has been resolved." Now, of course, we had learned this information earlier in the day, but later Fall reported favorably on Woodrow's health and that he was fully in command of foreign policy. In fact, from that point onward, Woodrow's health did improve, albeit slowly. Our lives developed a routine. I would help him with government business in the morning. He did need a lot of help. His memory was poor, and I had to explain a lot of things to him. His greatest joy was when Altrude would come round with her beautiful 2-year-old son, Gordon Grayson. Gordon and the president would sit together and have frequent conversations over milk and cookies. Woodrow did not attend the inauguration of his successor, Warren Harding, as he couldn't manage the steps. "Edith, the Senate threw me down the steps once before. I don't want to fall down again, this time on my own." And so we slipped away and entered private life. Our remaining 3 years together were marked by his continued decline. He passed one day on a Sunday in February. In a final cruel act, the Senate named Lodge to be its representative at the funeral, and that was the final insult. I requested that he not attend. When we left the White House, Woodrow's enemies had succeeded in making him very unpopular. He was blamed for all of the country's problems, even the influenza epidemic. I wonder if it wouldn't have been better for Woodrow to have died from an assassin's bullet. As the war ended, he would have died a hero. Look at how Lincoln is revered. I dare say Lincoln's reputation would have taken a nosedive if he had survived and had to cope with all the problems following his war. I have spent the last 40 years working to restore Woodrow's standing. His vision for the League of Nations was inspired. It's a tragedy that his vision was thwarted by petty politics. He would have been thrilled with the establishment of the United Nations. Oh, I think this is the dress I'm going to wear today. Is it still in style? I hope it'll make me look younger. Oh, what do I think of the Kennedys? I love them. Do you know that his grandfather, John Fitzgerald, was Lodge's opponent in the 1916 election? If he had beaten Lodge, oh well, everything would have been different. So, of course, I support Fitzgerald's grandson. What a pair they are, those Kennedys. They remind me of Woodrow and me. He is so handsome, and she has fashion sense like I do. What would I wish for them? Well, I hope they fare better than we did. And for Jackie, I pray she never has to experience heartache like I did that last year in the White House. It's very good of them to invite me to the inauguration. But I do have one regret. I secretly hoped that I would be invited to the inaugural ball. Woodrow was never much of a dancer, well, I may be old, but I would have loved to have gone to one last ball and to dance one last dance.